Every company right now is spending money on AI, and new studies just came out with a number that should stop everyone cold. 90% of enterprise leaders are increasing their AI budgets. 63% have seen almost no return. So, what is actually going wrong? Today's guest has a rare answer to that question. Josh Facto is the Chief Data and AI Officer and also Chief Information Officer at Teradata. So, Josh, welcome and thank you for joining. So, I'll ask the straight question, right? So, you are the Chief Information Officer at Teradata, and at the same time, you are holding Chief Data and AI Officer position as well. So, what explains a one person holding two positions?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ashish. Appreciate the question. Yeah, so I was Chief Data and AI Officer, initially recently appointed Chief Information Officer. I think the intention behind that move is to bring the technology, the capabilities closer to where the data and AI are so that we can remove friction and enable our employee base much faster and at a much more realistic scale. One of the limitations of just managing, one of those specific areas is that there are gaps, especially when trying to operationalize things at scale. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But breaking down some of those barriers within my own departments really helps to give us an advantage in how we deploy and how we think about deploying these technologies, and not just in a traditional IT capacity, but making sure that data AI just becomes foundational and strategic for the company.
Okay, no, that explains, right? So I'm just going straight to current Wakefield survey, and there are a lot of interesting facts, right? So what draws my attention to that report is 69% of C-level executives, they believe that their org is ready or already implementing agentic AI. And in the same org, only 57% VPs who see the same. So that's a huge 12% gap.
Yeah.
So what is your reading on it? Why you think this sort of gap, first of all, exists?
Yeah, and some of the so the specific stat you're referring to in the Wakefield study, it basically suggests, or doesn't basically, it concludes that there's a disparity between what executives at a company believe versus the VPs or low or even lower level employees believe at the very same company in terms of how mature they are in terms of deploying agentic capabilities. Some of that, of course, I think is leadership wanting to believe things into existence, right? Or wanting to hope things become the truth, or setting a certain expectation, right? I think one of the more shocking findings that comes out of that it comes out of the study is when you look at the actual maturity measurement, only about 7% of companies have actually reached a level of maturity from an operationalizing agentic AI perspective. That's a stark difference between the 69%, perceived agentic capability. I know that's not exactly apples to apples, but there's clearly a big discrepancy in the expectation that leadership has versus the reality that's forming on the ground, right? And that's something this study really helps to uncover and demystify a little bit and explain.
Okay.
Can I ask you something, Josh? Before we discuss how you became one person holding two positions. So I understand you told us why it was important. You showed us the intent, but what was the result? Did you see some customers saying, "Thank God that finally happened"?
Yeah, it might become a trend, Mark. I don't know. When I've been to forums recently, I've talked to some customers recently, and I think the general perception, especially from CDAOs, is, well, that must make it easier to do your job, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, that comes with owning all of the things that IT is responsible for, right? Some of which have nothing to do with data and AI necessarily, right? But if we look a couple of years from now, it's just a tool in the toolbox, right? We may not have a specific focus called out for artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is part of the toolkit that we use. It is technology, it is information, it is all of those things, right? And all of those don't work without data. So they naturally go together, of course. And how did that work out? It's been 2 months. I like to say it's working 2 or 3 months. I like to say it's working really well, Mark. But ask me again in 6 months, and I'll tell you for sure.
Okay. Yeah. But you pointed out one thing. It means more work for you.
100%. Yes, 100%. Two jobs, one person. Good deal for Teradata.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Good luck. Okay.
So, Josh, Teradata basically deals with many orgs and helping them to implement data in a way that AI becomes very easy. Not easy, but AI become a little bit smoother for them to implement, right? So you might have worked with many companies to that extent. So what is the structural difference you see between the companies for where the AI is working versus the companies where AI is not working as of now?
Yeah, the industry breakdown in the study is very telling, right? But it all points back to a set of common problems, I think, most of which is the foundation that it's built on. So if you look at AI productivity tools, right, there was obviously a rush to adopt AI individual productivity tools, rightly so, because the capabilities were tremendous. AI wasn't new, but bringing AI to a place where humans could interact with it in language form made it consumable for the first time, right? That was really what blew the lid off with ChatGPT. AI became consumable to individuals. Making that AI that's consumable to individuals work for an enterprise turns out is really difficult, right? And I think there was an expectation that you could just take one and make it work for both, but you rely on an enterprise's truth, sets of truths, temporal truths, context, evolving sets of context, autonomous knowledge. All of that stuff has to feed into it in order to make it work and actually drive any decisions that stick. So the industries, like if you take a look at healthcare, right, which I think is one of the most exciting fields to tap into from an artificial intelligence perspective, but the data is so under-described and contextualized in fields like healthcare because there's so much unstructured data, right? And so having a lack of description and context associated with that data means it's very hard to actually turn that into useful agentic capabilities across the enterprise. But that's what I'm excited about. It's like if you could, take a doctor's notes and correlate that with the metrics that are being read in real time, against the patient to pre-diagnose things. I mean, that's exciting stuff, but it's going to take time to get there if we don't build the right data and context foundation underneath.
So I think that explains the another very interesting data point. Like 90% of leaders are spending more on AI now, but only 63% of almost 63% have seen almost no return, right? So data you explained very well. So that could be the prominent result. Any other factor that you see?
Yeah, for sure. So the data goes along with the context, right? I think, and I'll mention two things. So as you said, huge gap, right? And by the way, the 90% of leaders are still planning on spending more in the next 12 months. So not only has spending been up, but it is going to continue to be up in spite of the fact that returns have been lacking, right? So that's a very interesting paradigm. So you've got 90% of the same leaders we polled across 1,000+ organizations saying we're going to spend more money, but we haven't seen very many returns on this investment at all, right? Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But that's because the people that know that that the potential is real. They can see through yes, there was a wave of kind of hysterics where you try to figure out, is this overblown, the hype scale, the hype trend, and then kind of an anchoring back. But people that live and breathe this stuff know what it's capable of if the right unlocks are achieved, right? So, and I can explain a couple of them. So the gap between individual productivity and enterprise deployment, as I mentioned, is a big one because employee and an individual person, you can provide all of the context you want, right? You can supply unlimited context to your individual client to make sure that it gets things right. And it'll get things wrong a lot, but you can correct it and you can make sure that it gets it right, right? So you can say if it's missing a data point, think about a stock trade value that doesn't have a timestamp on it. It's not very useful, right? If I don't know when the timestamp is for when that stock price was, it's not a useful point. I can't trade on it. What if it was a month ago? Right? So that context matters. Why am I asking the question? Who told me to ask the question? What decision am I trying to make? What persona am I? Right? All of those things you can feed your AI agent. You can feed it unlimited context. When you're doing it at enterprise scale, it has to figure out context across all the dimensions on its own. So where does it source all of that context from? It's not just the data in the description of the data, it's the full context surrounding it, right? What are the circumstances that led me to make that decision at that exact point in time? Because that's the way humans work. They're sitting in a seat and they know the reason they're making that particular decision at that particular point in time. AI doesn't have that luxury. So you have to like recreate that magic, which is, it turns out, is harder than I think people realized, regardless of how amazing the large language models are. The second point I would just add is that we didn't talk about specifically in this study is who's doing the work and how do you secure that, right? So that's a very real problem that is not completely solved yet. In other words, you can't just say, well, I'm offloading that work to an agent. Now you've empowered an agent to make decisions under whose permissions, what privileges are you granting that agent, and who's accountable for the decisions, right? Everyone's going to have slightly different kind of frameworks and approaches, but even the regulations of some of the higher regulated industries haven't caught up with that. There's still people that have to be held accountable when you're doing a Sarbanes-Oxley audit, right? So like until we can break down those barriers or tie agentic workloads to that same kind of methodology, there's a reluctance to deploy, right? Because if you overpower your agents, you'll have bigger problems on your hand, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's very interesting and encouraging. You're telling us that even though people didn't see immediate return, they're still planning to go ahead, and the next year they will spend. And that's wonderful because they understand the potential.
That's right.
Another thing that you mentioned is the key difference between us humans and the AI. It's the context. And that's what the AI is missing. That's what gives us humans hope. So it's all, whatever you're saying, it's very, very encouraging.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm just slightly changing the tangent, right? So I heard, Josh, you were talking about customer zero, right? Meaning whatever product you ship to client, your internal team is using first. So what is happening when your internal team using your product first? Are you guys always like first time you are good and we are good to ship to client, or just like what is your experience?
Yeah. Yeah, if only it were that easy. I mean, to be honest, it's the reason I started my job here. I was excited to be able to use Teradata because it has a reputation of being incredible from a performance and a history perspective. But I wanted to see it modernized and retain its relevance, or kind of be reborn in this era of AI. So my team has really helped to lean into that role of, and why that's been challenging. Teradata historically sold to huge companies, right? The biggest companies on earth were kind of powered, and still are, powering a lot of their infrastructure and data decision-making on a Teradata system. But we wanted to appeal, especially in this new modern era, to other types of enterprises that want to spin up the power of Teradata faster, because everything's moving faster. Everything is on a condensed timeline right now, right?
Yep.
So I was very interested in how can we help to influence that, make it easier to use. So Teradata spent a lot of time on usability, accessibility, time to value, and then of course the agentic harness and things like that. It's obviously great for me because it costs less money, right? I can use some of our capabilities at sort of list price.
Yep.
But also I like to play with the flexibility. My team likes to play with the flexibility. What can we run on the Teradata system versus running with large language models? You can host a small language model on a Teradata system, or we can run open source models this way, and we can distribute workloads across systems. We can spin up elastic compute, and then we can educate our customers on the best way to cost optimize for those things, right? I am our biggest critic, and I still love our products. So I give our Chief Product Officer, who's doing a tremendous job. He's only been here about a little over a year and a half. Very ambitious roadmap. I'm the first. My team and Teradata Corporate is the first consumer of everything that we develop, and we don't just use it in kind of a fictitious testing bed. We deploy it. We deploy it, and we put it to work against real workloads. So then we have some proof points, and we can talk with integrity to our customers, which means a lot.
So, sir, and you mentioned dog food, which is a term that I just recently heard from Anthropic. They said we do an extreme amount of eating our own dog food. Yes. So who came first? Who did it first? Did you learn from them?
Well, no, we've been drinking our own champagne. We call it here, Mark.
Okay.
We've been drinking our own
That's how you
champagne
call it. Nice.
since I started here about 8 years ago. So but I remember Microsoft had a pretty strong program around the decades ago. I know Teradata has always used Teradata, of course, not surprisingly, but really changing your culture to be like a Teradata first and like seeing the potential of what it can do and then building your whole company mindset around that. It really is a gear shift. I think Anthropic, if I were Anthropic, I'd be using unlimited Claude tokens too, right?
Yeah.
We use plenty of Claude tokens and I have to pay a lot for them, but yeah, I think we were here before Anthropic, so I think it was us.
You said it first. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So now, since you guys are dealing with a lot of data, right? So what is the security or governance risk, and how the general guideline at Teradata, like specifically with AI, quantum chips are also coming up, and there is a huge security concerns across the board. Now, Teradata dealing with huge data across the customer line. How you guys, what is your general mechanism of dealing with security threat related to
Yeah.
AI?
Well, we're definitely seeing a bit of a boomerang back to on-prem, interest in on-prem as a result of that. That doesn't directly answer your question, but I will answer it.
Yeah.
Which is good for Teradata. Teradata was originally born on-prem, moved to the, then expanded to the cloud. So now we have hybrid offerings, but data sovereignty is one of the steps that a lot of companies are taking and moving their stack to a place where they can control and isolate on premise is becoming more of a theme that we're seeing and a pattern that I think is going to grow more attractive and appealing to the industry over the next couple, several years, maybe even longer, because of all the different attack vectors that come into play, especially when you're running things in cloud. There's an additional mindset shift that the InfoSec culture and the AI leadership and CIOs across the board have to take. Not only is there the multiplication factor of the threats from outside, because now agents can do things across thousands of cycles and basically replicate thousands of humans in a way that hasn't been able. So the scale is changing, which means the time is compressing between how long it takes for new vulnerabilities to get discovered, which means more vulnerabilities, which means more things that have to be remediated and patched, right? So that cycle time just gets quicker and quicker. But the other thing is that I think is even more interesting and complicated is that there's a new attack vector, which is sort of a non-malicious internal attack vector, right? If I can call it that, which is, it's not a bad actor necessarily inside your own walls. It's agents, right? Which are trying to do everything they can to solve problems or fight their way out of solutions. They can do it on a level that humans just can't touch, right? So if you deploy one of these agents, and this is where the kind of the mythos scare came from, and Fable fear came from, is if you let loose one of those capabilities, you could actually find ways to expose or exfiltrate data from within, which is like, that's a different kind of problem, I think, than we're used to. We're used to dealing with, okay, well, you have, basically you give the lowest level security or least privileged access across the board, right? And you deal with, data access privileges could be time-based and things like that. But when you're talking about agents, if you want them to actually do things, you have to give them access to things. But if you give them access to things, now you have to figure out, how do I deal with that from a security perspective? So it's very, both ends are kind of converging at the same time, which makes it fascinating.
It is fascinating. Can you tell a little bit about what do you do for that? So you let them lose, but then what happens?
Yeah, defense and sure, Mark. So defense and depth is obviously a key, right? You need monitoring and controls from both the outside and the inside. There's also been I think a bit of a pendulum shift. We have to centralize. Companies have to centralize certain things. You just do. Citizen development, if you can even call it that, it's not the same as it was 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Half of the people doing citizen development aren't even developers. They can just, use a text conversation to basically build some kind of application. Yeah. We need to think seriously as technology leaders about how do we let those things get deployed. It's not just about who can build what. It's how do you deploy that? There's a big, and this goes back to the personal productivity versus enterprise productivity. It's up to us to build foundations where those things can be deployed upon securely, sandboxed, quarantined, so that the choices are only these 5 LLMs, and those 5 LLMs run in this particular space. And it's by design, it's by intention, right? And we give security to the agents this way. We grant access to the data this way, and it's uniform. And there's a governance built right into that across the board. And that's a pivot that a lot of companies have had to take, even us. We over-rotated on letting people kind of do too much. And then we said, all right, we need to pull some of that back. Now we're very much, focused on the autonomous knowledge platform and how do we govern the deployment of assets? Because it's like shadow IT gone wild, right?
That's very interesting. That reminds me of a Chinese wisdom that if you cook fish for a large pot, then you have to rotate very, very carefully. So you want that creativity, but you want it under control.
Exactly. Exactly. And that balance is really hard, especially at a tech company, right? Mark, like, I working for a tech company, you have people all over this company that know how to do stuff and they want to do stuff. They want to build things and they show their boss the thing that they built and everybody gets really excited about it. And they're like, oh, I just need to deploy it. Why aren't you letting me deploy this thing? But it's not that simple. It's like, well, you just hooked it up to some data that you had in a spreadsheet, or you used your own account to connect to an MCP server in this own thing in this application and then pull the data in. That's not the same thing as turning on an agent that's constantly running and trying to source the truth. And now, we're making decisions off of it much bigger. The stakes are much higher, right? And so anytime you're starting to share between people, I was at a CTO forum this week and they referred to it as single player versus multiplayer. Once you go from single player to multiplayer, you really have to change how you think about it. Like, no, you have to play in this space. This is how you do it.
Right. So to that extent, also, do you see the trend is going towards LLMs running locally versus just calling the endpoint of the frontier line model? Do you see that trend?
Yeah, some of it's going to be cost dependent, right? I mean, we're interested. We're all eager to see how the costs are going to shake out. Some of the biggest frontier models kind of came out reasonably priced because those companies were growing. And then as they looked to become profitable, the prices and also the compute costs went up, right? And the costs of the physical equipment have gone up. The token prices have gone through the roof. And so most companies can't afford to just allow unlimited token usage through Opus, right? Cloud Opus. You have to pull back and try to figure out what is the best way to utilize cost value, especially because of what we talked about earlier. The return on investment in some cases isn't necessarily there. So at what point do you stop letting, kind of allowing unlimited innovation and instead have kind of constrained innovation, which you were talking to, Mark, focused innovation. Let's call it focused innovation, right? So you can focus on specific goals and initiatives, but I also, it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese models kind of play out and whether some will be kind of more available for consumption, open source to be used outside of China and of course in America, European markets, because you can get good price value with comparable performance. They have started to catch up from a capability perspective. And so I think you're going to see a lot more experimentation, especially on-prem, where companies are willing to distribute workloads and say, well, I want IT or I want my company to decide which model is the right one to use. The thing I'm trying to do is sort of agnostic to that, right? I need an LLM. You figure out which LLM will get the job done. And you're starting to see that kind of abstraction layer building out, shared skills, shared markdown files, right? These different things that you can share across LLMs so that they all can hopefully give you similar answers. There's going to be a balance. There has to be a correction because people can't afford to use the frontier models at the price point they're going, forever.
Yeah. So Josh, you discussed about the ROI on token burn and all that kind of stuff. So in the beginning of 2026, like till first quarter, we heard a lot of layoffs. And now we are seeing the trend is little bit slowing down or even reversing in some case. And that is because you see enterprises are not getting the ROI in terms of the token. What do you feel?
There's probably a little of both, right? I think early on you saw some companies that were eager to claim victory, right? And say we've achieved some level of maturity with AI, which means we replaced X number of jobs because of AI, right? Whether that's true or how you can actually make that correlation is actually certainly up for debate. Similar to any automation, the goalpost is not necessarily to do the same things that humans are doing. I think that's the more interesting conversation, actually, is we're constantly talking about how can we use AI to recreate what people are doing, right? But as you go through that, the reality is the skill sets that you need, the workforce is shifting, right? It has to. The types of people you need, the skills that you need to understand the applicability of AI is going to change. That may result in a kind of a transformation or an evolution of the workforce that happens over time. So some people will kind of move on balance. If they're spending too much money, they have to offset that somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, in some cases, that becomes people. Hopefully, most companies are making smarter decisions as to how to get that return. And that's kind of what this study is trying to educate people on, is how can you get those returns so that you're not just looking to, try to replace people with AI, which I don't think is the right answer.
Yeah. No, so
It's
going
very
back to
interesting insights.
Yep. No, so going back to this Wakefield research again, another data point, it says like 66% of US leaders say that they are almost paralyzed on AI. France is at 50%, Germany is at 54%. So my question is twofold, right? What do they exactly mean, in your opinion, when they say that they are paralyzed on AI? And the second phase is why you think US is more stuck than even France and Germany?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some of that is probably cultural, in terms of why we're more stuck in the U.S. than in some other countries. But I think it speaks to the fact that the foundation was never built correctly before the rest of the house was starting to be built, right? So, over the last year or so, the pressure to adopt, the pressure to drive value and show value resulted in implementing solutions that were standing on weak foundations. And then what happens is the value doesn't come to fruition, or the pilots get thrown out, and then there's a lot of wasted work, right? So that creates like an impasse or a stalling point where it's saying, okay, well, how much of this foundation do we stop and kind of reinvest in versus do we just keep trying to find the right use cases? The answer is you can kind of do both, right? My advice, my sincere advice, is to find example use cases and data sets that you can fully contextualize across everything, across all dimensions. And you can build the pipelines and the foundations for how do you source knowledge? How do you source autonomous context? How do you build an agentic RAG pipeline across your company? You can do that using real examples and build that foundation. And then you get a compounding return. You do the next one, then you do the next one. And the more autonomy and learning, self-learning you build into that, the more value that starts to compound. But it's like companies haven't reached that threshold where they've gotten high enough so they can see the compounding returns yet. So it feels like they're stuck.
Okay.
So you're like saying that it's not because Americans are stupid. It's just the other way. It's because they have too much of that and they jumped into it, and that was too fast.
I think that's right. I mean, there's too much right now. There's too much right now. America or Europe, but definitely in my experience, from what I've seen, there is just too much content. People are building too much stuff. What do we do with all of that stuff? That creates a deadlock in your company. It paralyzes and I know that sounds counterintuitive, but unless you're figuring out how do I take all of the new stuff that's being developed and push it towards the bottlenecks that my company has, the bottlenecks in the business processes, the bottlenecks that produce value, the bottlenecks in revenue, bottlenecks in operating, unless I can push those things to those places, it's just noise, right? It's just more stuff that we have to manage. And I don't think companies were prepared for the amount of content and wrangling they were going to have to do to even rationalize AI opportunities across a company. It's like an endless amount of capabilities that you now have to figure out, well, what are the right things to use? So people are trying to get organized around that. All right, I need a catalog. I need to understand the skills that we have. You have to have a registry. You can register this thing and you're only allowed to build here, right? that's the correction that has to take place, because our shift needs to be towards moving from, okay, we freed up capacity to, okay, we freed up value. And that's not magic, and they're not the same thing always.
Yeah. So I think, according to you, Josh, then is it important for enterprises to upskill their own people or versus hiring the new ones? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you always want to give your existing employees a chance to succeed, right? And that's kind of the first place you go, upskilling your workforce, educating your workforce on the latest and greatest technologies. We owe that to people that work for us, to give them the tooling. And me as CIO, it's something I take seriously. I want to give people the tools that they need to be the best they can be at their job, but I also don't want to confuse them with too many things that they don't.
Yeah.
They kind of lost their place. We're we have a very we have a very strong partnership with the People organization and how we're rolling out kind of a workforce transformation model, bringing people up to speed on how to use LLMs, how to use chat interfaces, pragmatic things that apply to specific job categories, the less technical roles. What does it mean to finance versus, human resources, et cetera, right? So, you start there, but we are going to start to build kind of an agentic capability into the workforce, right? So if as agents become kind of part of the workforce, do you have the right people? I mean, that you have to ask that questions, and certain skills are going to surface as being more essential than others. You may have somebody that was super specialized in a specific technology that may not necessarily be as important anymore. And now you're looking for something that's like a softer skill, right? So you're going to have to reevaluate it against the priorities that you have. Certainly, I think the new hires are going through a different set of questions, right? There's a different set of expectations or hopes with anybody new that you're interviewing, or students coming, interns or coming fresh out of college. Like, this kind of needs to be built into the way you think, right? Out of the gate versus a reskilling. So it's both.
And then, so what is your advice to the people who are doing computer science right now into the universities? Where should they focus on?
Yeah. So I think computer science still has its value, but I would definitely encourage everybody to understand the applicability of what you're doing to a modern AI world. And I know that sounds simple, but computer science needs to be reframed a bit from an education perspective, from a higher education perspective, to how it applies to an AI-driven culture or a world that exists that has LLMs in it, right? You have to think about it differently. What is the role of the machine learning, the model training, the different components that you can control versus what you're going to borrow from AI or or take as a commodity from an AI service provider? The other thing is security. Anybody that can blend AI and security together right now, I think is super valuable. So I would encourage anybody to look in that direction. But I also think it's encouraging more people to look at soft skills and think about soft skills more. Because at the end of the day, if you start to, if the capabilities people have start to level out a little bit, in other words, you've made more people more powerful with what they can do. Understanding how does that actually correlate to the business? How does that correlate to the things you're trying to solve? How do I explain it to people? How do I change the culture of a company? Those soft skills are going to become, are more important than ever, I'd say. Right?
Yeah.
So don't give up. Just think about it a little bit differently.
Yeah. And should they use flexible. Mark and I usually debate this question, right? So should student use ChatGPT to submit their research paper, for example, or any other LLM for that matter? But should they allowed to use or not? Because in my opinion, at the end of the day, they are going to use it in their actual work or business or whatever they are doing. But at the same time, maybe they are not learning. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, exactly.
One question. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't envy professors right now, but I think it's to give you, and maybe I'm cheating with this answer because I'm going to maybe split the middle of you two.
Yeah.
I think you have to pass a certain threshold of understanding before you should be allowed to lean on the LLMs, right? And what I mean by that is if you skip over the fundamentals and just use the LLM to build it, you didn't you didn't learn anything, right? But you have to learn the foundational things of how do I build the content? How does the LLM, you have to know how to write, for example, right? So you can't just skip over writing. And so you have to figure out what is the right threshold or level of understanding I need people to have before it becomes, okay, now you've reached this level of excellence in understanding, you appreciate the foundational concepts, because at the end of the day, you need to validate what's coming out of it. And Ashish, your name is going to be on it. It doesn't matter if Claude wrote it. Your name's on it, right? You're going to get the grade. So you're accountable.
Co-author.
Yeah, he's a co-author. That's right. So you're accountable for it, which means you need to understand it, and you need to understand how do you feed that thing the best way possible. But then I do think we owe it to the workforce or the future workforce to educate them on how to use it, because otherwise they'll be behind. Right? The rest of the world is going to be doing it in the real world.
Yep.
It's only fair. It's kind of like after computers came out or calculator came out, there was a certain point in time where they were like, you can't use a calculator until you get to this point, right? But then once you reach a certain level of achievement in mathematics, they're like, okay, now you can use a calculator because you understand the difference between sine and cosine.
Yeah.
The same rules should apply, I think, in this case.
Perfect. I think this is a great view. Yeah. I mean, all right, Joe. So
yeah,
I think
that's a great view, but let me ask one question. So if the student doesn't listen, what if he says, oh, I reached that level that I have to reach with the help of AI?
Yeah, the reactive side of that is how do teachers understand what came out of AI and what didn't, right?
Yeah.
And we may have to add more checkpoints, especially in the virtual learning scenarios, where we can kind of understand what they're doing from a tooling perspective or validate the things that they're producing. I don't know that we have that we've learned that capability yet, or professors have learned that capability yet, but we'll catch up.
Yeah,
we'll
that's
find
a good
ways.
answer. I think it's more for the teachers also. They shouldn't just be I'm forbidding you to do that. They should understand and teach the student.
Yes.
So Josh, thank you so much. So one last thing, right? Your message to Fortune 500 board what is your message who would like to proceed ahead with AI and they're confused? So what is your message to them?
Yeah. So first thing is truth. Truth is the key to making AI succeed. I know it's called artificial intelligence. Don't be confused by the name. It needs truth in order to make decisions that your company can rely on. It needs truth and it needs context around those decisions. So the concept is what we refer to as the autonomous knowledge platform. You need an autonomous knowledge platform strategy to help anchor your artificial intelligence to if you want to be able to scale AI decision making. Without that, we're risking veering off into a divergence from any semblance of truth, which is a very scary place that I don't want to be in. The other thing I'd say is look at the potential or think about the potential of what AI can do that humans have never been able to do before. That's what gets me the most excited. That's what will get your employees the most excited. That's what will help get the culture excited and away from the idea of AI is here to replace human jobs. AI is going to unlock capabilities in healthcare that we've never had before. It's going to unlock capabilities in vaccine creation that we've never had before, in space exploration that we've never had before. That stuff is exciting and it's real. And so think about how human plus AI makes for a better version of human. Instead of overreacting to, we're worried about the biases that AI is going to have. Well, people have a lot of biases. People aren't perfect. Let's try to build something that's better, right? To me, that's exciting. Is building things that can be even more virtuous. And I know that sounds idealistic, but
I liked it. It's a chance for humanity to improve itself.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Josh. It has been pleasure discussing with you. And if you have some time in future, we'll see how this role actually proceeded 6 months later, like you said.
Yes. I'll let you know if I've been successful or not.
All right. All the very best. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Have a good weekend.
You too.